What if Tywin Lannister raised Jon Snow? Not by choice. Tywin Lannister does nothing by accident and nothing against his own interest, which means there is only one way this happens. He found out. He found out what Jon was. And instead of destroying the boy, which would have been the obvious move, the safe move, the move that every instinct Tywin has would have recommended, he looked at a child who was the last surviving Targaryen and saw something that the most calculating mind in Westeros could not afford to throw away. Leverage. Legacy. A weapon so rare it only exists once. What if Tywin Lannister took the boy who should have been his enemy and made him a Lannister? Not in name, not officially, but in every way that matters. In how he thinks, in how he moves, in the language he speaks when he walks into a room full of people who want to destroy him. What if the man who spent his life teaching his children that a Lannister always pays their debts took a Targaryen bastard and taught him the same lesson? What if Jon Snow grew up in Casterly Rock? This is what happens when the coldest man in Westeros raises the boy the realm was built around. And this is what Jon Snow becomes when the North never shapes him, when only gold does. Casterly Rock. 284 AC, 1 year after the war. The letter comes from Dawn. Tywin does not read it immediately. He sets it on his desk and finishes the report he is working through, because a letter from Dawn that arrives at dawn is either catastrophic or merely urgent, and either way it will still be what it is in the time it takes to finish a page. He finishes the page. He picks up the letter. He reads it once. He sets it down. He picks it up and reads it again. Then he puts it in the fire and watches it burn completely before he calls for Kevan. Kevan Lannister, his brother, arrives in the way Kevan always arrives, steadily and without theatre. The most reliable man Tywin has ever known, and the one he relies on most and thanks least. He enters the solar and reads the expression on Tywin's face, which is no expression at all, which is itself the most significant expression Tywin has. He says, "What happened?" Tywin says, "Sit down." Kevan sits. Tywin says, "Do you remember the source I placed in the Tower of Joy?" Kevan says, "The Dornish contact." "Yes." Tywin says, "He has sent word." He says it without inflection. Lyanna Stark did not die in the tower. She died shortly after, of childbed fever, a week after giving birth. Kevan is very still. Tywin says, "The child is alive. A boy, being carried north by Eddard Stark, with the intention of passing it off as his bastard." The room is quiet. Kevan says, "Rhaegar's son." Tywin says, "Yes." A longer silence. Kevan says, "If Robert knew." Tywin says, "Robert must not know." Kevan says, "Then we say nothing." The child disappears into the north as Ned Stark's bastard, and Tywin says no. Kevan looks at his brother. Tywin is looking at his hands. The flat, deliberate regard of a man thinking in the specific way that Tywin thinks, which is not from the immediate to the long term, but from the long term backward to the immediate, starting with what he wants the world to look like in 20 years, and working toward what must be done today. He says, "The child is the last Targaryen." Kevan says, which is an argument for letting the North have him and forgetting. Tywin says, "The last Targaryen in the hands of Ned Stark grows up northern, grows up with a Stark sense of honor and a Stark inability to play the game, grows up exactly the kind of person who ends up dead in a courtyard or executed on a sept somewhere because he said the wrong thing to the wrong king at the wrong moment." He pauses. The last Targaryen in the hands of Robert Baratheon does not grow up at all. Kevan says, "And in our hands?" Tywin is quiet for a moment. He says, "In our hands, the last Targaryen grows up knowing what the world actually is." He stands. He says, "Intercept Stark before he reaches Winterfell. I want the child here within the month." Kevan says, "And if Stark refuses?" Tywin looks at his brother. He says, "Offer him what he cannot refuse. The safety of his family, the security of his lordship, the assurance that no Lannister eye will turn north for a generation." He pauses. "And make him understand that refusing is the choice most likely to get the boy killed. Because if I found out, Robert can find out. And if Robert finds out before we control the situation, he does not finish the sentence. He does not need to." Kevan stands. He says, "I'll go myself." Tywin nods. Kevin leaves. Tywin sits alone in his solar at the top of Casterly Rock, and he looks at the sea, and he thinks about what he has just set in motion, and whether it is the right thing. He does not think about right and wrong in the way most people think about right and wrong. He thinks about what serves the Lannister name. He thinks about the boy in someone's arms on the road north. Dark-haired. Targaryen-blooded, the last ember of a dynasty that burned itself out and left this one small coal in the ashes. He thinks, that coal can start a fire. Or it can be smothered. He does not smother things that can start fires. That would be wasteful. The King's Road. North. 284 Ac. Ned Stark is 5 days from Winterfell when Kevin Lannister finds him. He is riding with a small company, 6 men and a wet nurse and the child, riding with the specific pace of a man who wants to reach home and cannot hurry for reasons of the child and the road and the necessary pretense that this is ordinary travel, nothing remarkable, just a lord returning north from a war. He is not a man who performs easily. This is Ned Stark's great quality and his great liability. He cannot lie. The lies he has told since the Tower of Joy have been the most costly thing he has ever done, more costly than the battles, more costly than the grief, because they live in him wrong, like a blade turned the wrong way, and he feels them every hour. The Lannister party numbers 20. Kevin rides at the front. They stop on a narrow section of the road where the hills press close on both sides, and Ned is aware, immediately, of the tactical nature of the positioning, the way it removes certain options from the conversation before the conversation begins. He is aware also that this is not an accident. He stops his horse. Kevin says, Lord Stark. My brother sends his regards. Ned says, Lord Kevin. I was not aware the Lannisters had interest in the northern roads. Kevin says, my brother has interest in many things. He pauses. He would like to speak with you, privately, about a mutual concern. Ned's hands tighten on the reins. He says, what concern? Kevin looks at the company, at the woman with the child. He says, my brother knows what you are carrying, Lord Stark. He has known for 3 weeks. He pauses. He would like to discuss what happens next, not with steel, with conversation. He is offering you the conversation before the alternatives become necessary. Ned looks at the hills. He looks at his 6 men. He looks at the 20 Lannister soldiers. He looks at the child in the wet nurse's arms. He says, what does Tywin Lannister want with a bastard child from a dead woman? Kevin says, not a bastard child, Lord Stark. My brother is very specific about this. He looks at Ned with the steady eyes of a man conveying a message he has been asked to convey precisely. The last Targaryen. The road is very quiet. The wind comes down from the hills. Ned's face does not change, but his hands loosen on the reins. Because Kevin is right, and Ned knows he is right, and Ned knows that if Tywin knows, the calculation about what is safest for the child has just changed in ways that Ned's honor and Ned's plans and Ned's promise do not have adequate answers for. He says, where? Kevin says, Casterly Rock. My brother prefers his own ground for important conversations. Ned says, and if I say no? Kevin says, my brother says to tell you that no is an answer he will respect. He will also tell you what he knows to Robert Baratheon within the week, not because he wishes the child harm, because the information then is out of his hands and in Robert's, which means it is out of everyone's hands. The silence extends. Ned thinks about Lyanna, about the promise, about what she asked him to do and what she could not have anticipated when she asked it, because she was dying, and the world she was asking him to protect the child from did not yet include Tywin Lannister knowing. He says, I'll come. They ride to Casterly Rock. Casterly Rock. Tywin's solar. 284 Ac. The room smells of candle wax and old stone. Casterly Rock is not like other castles. Other castles are built on the land, rising from it. Casterly Rock is carved into a mountain that contains more gold than any mine in the known world. It is ancient and enormous, and it smells of wealth at the molecular level, the specific scent of a place where power has lived for so long it has become geological. Ned sits across from Tywin. He has met Tywin before. At court. At tourneys. He has always found him the way everyone finds him. Completely controlled, entirely present, and fundamentally impossible to read. The man looks at you, and you feel catalogued. Ned puts the child on the table between them. Not literally. The wet nurse is in the anteroom. But he puts the fact of the child on the table, names it, gives Tywin the directness he came here prepared to give. He says, his name is Jon. His mother named him before she died. Tywin looks at the door to the anteroom, and then at Ned. He says Jon. He says it with no particular inflection, registering. He says, you are aware of what he is. Ned says, I have been aware since he was born. Tywin says, and your plan was to raise him in Winterfell as your bastard. Ned says, my plan was to keep him safe. He says it with the specific simplicity of a man who has one reason and means it entirely. Tywin says, a noble ambition poorly executed. Ned's jaw tightens. Tywin says, not because of your intentions, because of the information environment. You are one of 12 people who survived the Tower of Joy. Howland Reed is another. The Kingsguard who were there are dead. But the Dornish have long memories and loose servants, and the question of what Ned Stark carried out of that tower has been asked in enough rooms that eventually it reaches someone with the resources to pursue the answer. He pauses. He says, I have those resources. Ned says, and Robert? Tywin says, Robert does not have my resources. He has wine and a throne and an emotional investment in not knowing things he cannot undo. He pauses. At present, this information ends with me. I intend it to remain that way. Ned looks at him. He says, why? Tywin sets down the cup he has not been drinking from. He says, because I am a man who understands the value of things, and the last surviving Targaryen is the most valuable thing in the current political landscape of Westeros. He looks at Ned with the flat attention of someone whose statements are never decorative. Not to Robert, not to me in the sense you suspect. He pauses, valuable in the sense that his existence is a fact that does not become safe simply because it is suppressed. Facts have a way of becoming known. The question is who controls the knowing. Ned says, you want to control him. Tywin says, I want to ensure he survives to be useful. His own voice, his own choices, his own life. He pauses, under my roof where I can see him. Ned says, he is a child, not a piece on a board. Tywin says, every child born with significance is both. The question is whether the people around them understand this or pretend they don't. He looks at Ned. You have been pretending. It has worked for a year. It will not work for 20. The room is quiet. Ned says, what exactly are you proposing? Tywin says, the boy stays here. He is raised as a ward of Casterly Rock, not a Lannister in name, not publicly acknowledged as anything more than a child under my protection. He is educated and trained and kept safe. When the time is right, when the political landscape permits it, we determine what his existence means and how to use it constructively. Ned says, use it. Tywin does not flinch from the word. He says, yes, use it. This is what powerful things are for. Ned is very still. He thinks about Lyanna, about what she asked. He promised to keep the child safe. He promised. She said his name with her last breath and asked for the keeping, and he has been keeping it since. This is not what she imagined when she asked. But she also did not imagine Tywin Lannister. He says, I want assurances. Tywin says, name them. Ned says, the child is not harmed, not used against the North, not revealed to Robert, not made into a weapon against the people who should be his family. Tywin says, agreed. Ned says, I want to be able to see him, not often, but I want to know he is alive and well. Tywin says, agreed. Ned says, and when he is old enough to understand, he is told the truth about who he is, not your version of it. The truth. Tywin is quiet for a moment. He says, agreed. He says it the way he says things he intends to honor, which is flatly, without embellishment, the specific delivery of a man whose word is his currency and who protects the currency. Ned looks at him. He thinks, I don't trust you. He thinks, I don't have better options. He thinks, she asked me to keep him safe, and safe is Casterly Rock, improbably, impossibly, here. He says, all right. He stands. He goes to the anteroom. He takes the child from the wet nurse, and he holds him for a moment. This boy, who has his sister's northern blood and a dragon prince's name, and the weight of the world attached to him in ways that are not fair and cannot be helped. He says, very quietly, to the child who cannot understand, I will come back. You will know me. I promise. He carries him back into the solar. He puts him in Tywin Lannister's arms. Tywin looks down at the child. His face does something that Ned does not expect. Not warmth. Tywin does not do warmth. But something careful. Something that is paying very close attention. He says, Jon. The child looks at him with the grey eyes of the north and the particular unimpressed expression of a baby who has been passed between too many people today. Tywin looks at Ned. He says, you may leave, Lord Stark. Ned leaves. He rides north. He carries the absence of the child the entire way. Casterly Rock. 290 ac. 6 years later. Jon is 6 years old, and he is being taught a lesson. The lesson is about grain futures. He is sitting at the table across from the master of coin for the Rock, a man named Harris, who is competent, and not much more. And Harris is explaining how the harvest projections from 3 years of records can be used to anticipate the price of grain in the coming year and position Lannister contracts advantageously. Jon is 6 years old. He is listening with the focused quality of a child who has learned that not listening has specific consequences in this household, not dramatic ones, not violent ones, but the particular cold consequence of Tywin's disapproval, which arrives in the form of silence and a certain quality of stillness that is somehow worse than shout. He says, if we buy the contracts when prices are low and the harvest is good, and hold them for the year when the harvest is poor, Harris says, then we sell when the price is high. Yes. Jon says, but then the people who need the grain can't afford it. Harris blinks. Jon says, the poor people. If the price is high because we held the contracts, then the small folk can't buy bread. Harris looks slightly panicked, which is the expression of a man who is not prepared for this angle. Tywin enters. He does not make an entrance. He simply arrives, because Tywin is always arriving, always present in every room before you have fully registered his presence in it. He heard the last exchange. He looks at Jon. He says, continue. Jon says, I said that if we hold the grain contracts and sell when prices are high, the small folk can't afford bread. Tywin says, and? Jon says, and that seems like it creates problems. He says it carefully. The way a 6-year-old presents an observation to a very powerful man. Hungry people are angry people. Angry people cause problems that cost more than the profit from the grain contracts. Tywin studies him. He says, correct. He looks at Harris. He says, you may go. Harris goes, visibly relieved. Tywin sits across from Jon. He says, where did you learn that? About angry people. Jon says, old man. He says it immediately, then catches himself. Not old Nan. That is Ned Stark's household. He has heard stories second-hand, from letters, from the rare visits. He says, from the book about the Dance of the Dragons. The small folk uprisings. Tywin says, you read that. Jon says, I read everything. He pauses. You told me to. Tywin says, I told you to read the histories. I did not specifically assign the Dance of the Dragons to a 6-year-old. Jon says, it was on the shelf. Tywin looks at this child. He looks at him the way he has looked at him for 6 years, which is with the particular attention of a man who is running an ongoing assessment and updating it every time he has new information. He has been assessing Jon since the day Ned Stark put him in his arms, and he has not finished the assessment because the assessment keeps expanding to accommodate new data. The child is unusual. He said this to Kevin in the 2nd year. Kevin said, most children are unusual to adults who don't know many children. Tywin said, not like this. Jon at 6 has the specific quality of a person who is older than their chronological age in the ways that matter and completely age-appropriate in the ways that don't. He plays in the yard with Tywin Lannister's boys and chases cats with the abandon of any 6-year-old. He also reads grain reports and asks questions about supply chains that surprise men twice his age. He has grey eyes that Tywin has not remarked on to anyone. He has dark hair that Tywin has also not remarked on. He is, to the household, Lord Tywin's ward, a minor lord's son from somewhere unremarkable. The cover story is thin in the way of cover stories that no one is curious enough about to press. No one presses. Tywin says, "You were right about the grain contracts. There is a balance between profit and stability. Maximize one at the expense of the other, and you lose both eventually." He pauses. This is the thing most men with power never learn. They optimize for today's profit and create tomorrow's rebellion. Jon says, "Is that what happened with the Targaryens?" Tywin is still for a moment. He says, "In part." Jon says, "And with the Mad King?" Tywin says, "Also in part." Jon says, "What was the rest of it?" Tywin looks at him. He says, "Madness has its own logic. It does not respond to correction the way poor strategy does." He pauses. "The rest of it was that no one stopped it early enough." Jon says, "Why not?" Tywin says, "Because stopping it required someone willing to pay the price of stopping it. And the men who could have paid were not willing." Jon says, "Were you?" Tywin says, "I made choices I could live with." He says it without inflection. They were not all correct. Jon looks at him. He is 6 years old, and he is looking at Tywin Lannister with the grey eyes that are not Lannister eyes, and the attention that is not Lannister attention, and something in the quality of the looking that is something else entirely, something older, something from a line of people who commanded fire and built an empire. He says, "Were you willing to pay it? If you had to?" Tywin says, "That question has no useful answer now." Jon says, "I'm not asking for a useful answer. I'm asking for a true one." Tywin is quiet for a long moment. He says, "Go do your mathematics lesson." Jon goes. Tywin sits alone in the room. He thinks, that child is going to be extraordinary or catastrophic. He has not yet determined which. He thinks it might be both. Casterly Rock, 293 AC. 9 years later. Jon is 9 years old, and he is learning to fight. The master-at-arms is a man named Sir Adam, who served the Rock for 20 years, and who approaches training with the particular methodology of someone who has trained many children and knows which ones will be worth the time. He knows this one will be worth the time approximately on the 3rd day. The 3rd day Jon does something in a spar that Adam has only seen in 1 or 2 people in his career, which is that he loses badly and immediately identifies precisely why and corrects it in the next exchange. Not gradually, immediately. The adjustment is complete and correct, and it is as if the failure never happened, except that it is also incorporated, filed, made useful. He tells Tywin this. Tywin says, "Good. Push him harder." Sir Adam pushes harder. Jon responds to harder with better. By the time he is 9, he is fighting in a style that is not purely anything. It is not the southern style. It is not the water dance. It is not the northern style he has never been taught. It is the specific style of someone who has been exposed to multiple approaches and processed all of them and kept what works and discarded what doesn't. It looks, to those who know what to look for, like someone who has done this before. In his blood. In some way, his blood remembers. Jon does not think about this. He is 9 years old and he thinks about sword forms and grain reports and the specific problem of why his Latin is better than his High Valyrian when they are both difficult languages and the difficulty should be roughly equivalent. He says this to Tywin. They eat breakfast together, which has been the arrangement since Jon was 4. Not warmly. Tywin does not do warmth at breakfast or at any other meal. But consistently. Every morning. Jon at Tywin's right hand, going through the day's schedule and the week's numbers, and occasionally, when Tywin decides to teach, and Jon is alert enough to receive it, something more. He says, "My Latin is stronger than my Valyrian, but they're both dead languages, and I study them the same amount." Tywin says, "They are not the same difficulty." Jon says, "Why not?" Tywin says, Latin is orderly. The grammar is logical and consistent, and the exceptions are few. High Valyrian is the opposite. It was the language of a people who communicated as much through context and implication as through the words themselves. Understanding it requires understanding the culture, not just the language. He pauses. You understand order well. You are still learning implication. Jon says, because I read too literally. Tywin says, you think in straight lines. He says it as assessment, not criticism, though the distinction is narrow. The world is not a straight line. Jon says, you think in straight lines. Tywin looks at him. Jon says, I've watched you. When you plan, you go from where you are to where you want to end up, and you find the most direct route. Tywin says, and? Jon says, and that works when you control all the variables. When you don't, the straight line breaks. Tywin says, you have been watching me plan. Jon says, you told me to watch everything. Tywin says, I told you to read everything. Jon says, you also watch everything. So I assumed. Tywin says, you assumed correctly. He pauses. Continue. Jon says, the straight line breaks when you hit a variable you didn't anticipate. And the variables you don't anticipate are usually people. Because people don't behave like grain contracts. He pauses. Lord Baelish, for example. Tywin looks at him sharply. Jon says, he came to the Rock last month. I watched him in the Great Hall. He talks to people the way someone talks who is deciding how much of what they want they can get from each person. He is always calculating. But the calculation is about feeling, not about numbers. He finds what people want, and he offers them a version of it. Tywin says, and. Jon says, and your straight line doesn't account for that kind of thinking. You plan against what people should rationally do. He doesn't do what he should rationally do. Tywin says no. He doesn't. Jon says, so how do you plan against him? Tywin is quiet for a moment. He says, you don't plan against him. You plan around him. You accept that he will move unpredictably, and you build your position so that his unpredictability serves you rather than threatens you. Jon says, how? Tywin says, by being the fixed point. By ensuring that whatever Littlefinger does, the structure you have built is solid enough that he can only maneuver within it, not around it. Jon thinks about this. He says, that requires knowing all the edges of the structure. Tywin says, yes. That is why knowledge is the foundation of everything. Not gold, not armies, knowledge. He looks at Jon. You have been building yours. Continue. Jon nods. He eats. He thinks about Littlefinger. He thinks about straight lines and curves. He files everything. Casterly Rock, 295 AC, 11 years later. Jon is 11 years old when Tywin tells him the truth. He does not tell him gently. Tywin does not have a gentle telling. He summons Jon to the solar on an evening when the sun is going down over the sea and the light comes through the west facing windows in the flat gold of late afternoon, and sits across from him and says, there are things you need to know about who you are. Jon says, I know some of it. Tywin says, how much? Jon says, I know. I am not who you say I am. I know that Ned Stark comes to see me twice a year and looks at me the way people look at things they gave up and still miss. I know that you look at me differently than you look at your grandchildren. Not more warmly. Differently. Like I am a specific kind of valuable that the others are not. He pauses. He says, I think my parents were important. Tywin says, yes. Jon says, I think my mother was Lyanna Stark. Tywin is still. Jon says, Ned Stark's eyes. The way he looks at me. And the color of mine. Stark grey. I read the histories. The Stark coloring is distinct. Tywin says, and your father? Jon looks at him. He says, Rhaegar Targaryen. The room holds the name. Jon says it calmly. Not because it does not affect him. Because he has been building toward this moment for 3 years, assembling the pieces, sitting with the implications long enough that when the confirmation comes, it lands in prepared ground rather than virgin territory. Tywin says, yes. Jon says, the last Targaryen. Tywin says, yes. Jon says, and you kept this from Robert because, Tywin says, Robert would have killed you, would still kill you if he knew. He pauses. Robert Baratheon was built from grief and rage, and he has spent 15 years drinking both, and neither has diminished. Jon says, and you kept me because. He waits. This is the question he has been building toward longer than the others. The one underneath all the others. Not who am I, but why am I here? Tywin says, because you are not nothing. Jon says, that is not an answer. Tywin says, it is the only honest answer. He looks at Jon. I am a man who does not waste things of value. A Targaryen heir is not nothing. What he becomes depends on who raises him. What he becomes under me is something useful. What he becomes under Ned Stark, or, worse, under no one at all, is either a dead bastard or a problem no one can solve. Jon says, you made me a weapon. Tywin says, I made you educated, capable, aware of how the world works. He pauses. What you do with that is your choice. Jon says, is it? Tywin says, everything is a choice. That is the first thing I taught you, even if I did not say it in those words. He pauses. You are not a Lannister. You are not a Stark. You are not defined by what your father was, or what your grandfather was, or what anyone expects the name Targaryen to mean. He looks at Jon. You are what you decide to be. The blood is the start. The choice is everything after. Jon looks at him. He is 11 years old, and he has just been told he is the last Targaryen, and the most powerful man in Westeros raised him on purpose. And he is sitting with all of this in a room full of gold afternoon light. He says, what do you want from me? Tywin says, nothing yet. Jon says, eventually. Tywin says, eventually I want you to be ready for what the world is going to need from you. He pauses. The realm is worse than it looks. The throne is held by a man who is diminishing every year. The succession is compromised in ways I know and others will discover. There is something coming from the north that requires a specific kind of response, and I have been reading the Watch's reports long enough to know that the response is not political. Jon says, the north. Tywin says, the wall. The things beyond it. Jon says, you believe the reports. Tywin says, I believe the pattern of the reports. Individual reports can be wrong. 30 years of consistent reports from different men in different conditions, describing the same things with the same specific language. He pauses. That is not error. That is data. Jon says, and you think I have something to do with it? Tywin says, I think the blood of Valyria has something to do with it. He says it flatly, without mysticism, the assessment of a man applying reason to ancient things. He says, the Targaryens commanded fire. What the wall holds back is cold. He pauses. I am not a man who believes in prophecy. I am a man who believes in patterns. And the pattern suggests that you are part of whatever is coming. Jon looks at him. He says, you've known this for years. Tywin says, I've suspected it. Jon says, and you said nothing until now. Tywin says, you were not ready until now. Jon says, how do you know I'm ready now? Tywin says, because you knew who you were before I told you. He looks at Jon. Ready does not mean comfortable. It means capable of receiving information without being destroyed by it. Jon nods. He looks at the sea through the window. He thinks about who he is. He is the last Targaryen. He has been raised by Tywin Lannister, taught to think in political structures and financial patterns and the specific mathematics of power. He has been trained to fight by a man who trains soldiers, not princes, which means he fights like a soldier rather than a showpiece. He has been given the tools. He has not yet been given the direction. He says, tell me about the north. Everything you know. Tywin tells him. Casterly Rock. Ned Stark visits 288 Act. Ned comes every year in the first week of spring. He comes quietly, with a small retinue, and he stays 4 days, and he sees Jon, and he goes home. This is the arrangement. It has been the arrangement for 4 years. The visits are brief and managed, and Tywin is always present for part of them. Not because he does not trust Ned, but because Tywin does not leave arrangements he has made unobserved. Jon is 4 years old at the first visit he remembers. He remembers it as a quality of attention. Ned Stark crouches to his level, which most adults do not do, and he looks at Jon with grey eyes. The same grey as Jon's own, and he says nothing for a long moment. He just looks. Then he says, "You look well." Jon says, "I am well." Ned says, "Are you happy?" Jon thinks about this with the seriousness of a 4-year-old who takes questions seriously. He says, "Mostly. Lord Tywin is strict." Ned says, "I know." Jon says, "He makes me read a lot." Ned says, "Is that bad?" Jon thinks again. He says, "No. I like reading." He pauses. "He's teaching me about money." Ned says, "Is he?" Jon says, "How grain contracts work." He says it with 4-year-old specificity. "It's interesting." Ned looks at him. Jon says, "Do you know how grain contracts work?" Ned says, "Not well." Jon says, "I'll explain it." He proceeds to explain grain contracts to Ned Stark with the thoroughness of a child who has recently learned something and wants to demonstrate the learning. Ned listens to the whole thing. When Jon finishes, Ned says, "That's very thorough." Jon says, "Lord Tywin says if you understand it well enough to explain it, you understand it." Ned says, "That is good advice." Jon says, "He gives a lot of good advice. He gives it like it costs something." He says this with the particular perception of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned to soften observations. Like he is deciding if you deserve it. Ned almost smiles. He says, "Does he think you deserve it?" Jon says, "I think so." He keeps giving it. They sit together in the garden of Casterly Rock for an hour. Ned asks questions about Jon's days, and Jon answers them with the completeness of a child who has not yet learned to manage what he reveals. Tywin watches from a distance, close enough to observe, far enough to be courtless. On the second day, Ned asks to speak with Jon alone. Tywin permits this. They walk in the garden. Ned says, "I need to tell you something. Not who you are. Not yet. Lord Tywin has asked me to leave that for when you are older. But something else." Jon says, "What?" Ned says, "You have family. Beyond this castle." He pauses. Family who do not know you exist. Who would want to know you if they could. Jon says, "Your family." Ned says, "And your mother's family. She had brothers. She had..." He stops. He has a specific relationship to grief that Jon, at 4, can see without being able to name. She was someone people loved very much. Jon says, "What was she like?" Ned says, "She was the most alive person I have ever known." He says it simply, with the particular honesty of someone describing a fact they have been carrying for years. She was wild and fierce, and she laughed loudly in places where you were not supposed to laugh. She was kind to people who had nothing. She was impossible to ignore. Jon looks at him. He says, "Do I look like her?" Ned says, "Your eyes, your coloring." "Yes." He pauses. "A great deal like her." Jon nods. He thinks about this for a moment. He says, "I wish I knew her." Ned says, "I know." Jon says, "Do you miss her?" Ned says, "Every day." They walk in the garden. Jon slips his hand into Ned's. He does not know why. He is not a demonstrative child. Tywin's household is not a demonstrative household. But something about this specific person, this tall, quiet man with the same grey eyes, makes the gesture feel right. Ned holds his hand. They walk. On the 4th day, Ned leaves. Jon watches him ride out through the gate. He does not cry. He is 4 years old, and he has not had enough time with Ned Stark to grieve his leaving in the way you grieve people you are deeply attached to. But he watches. He watches until the horses disappear around the first bend in the road. He turns back to the castle. Tywin is standing at the gate. He says, "Come. Your tutor is waiting." Jon goes. He goes with the quality of a child who has just been given something and had it removed in the same 4 days, and who is processing this as information about the way things work, which is how he processes most things. He files it. He does not forget it. Casterly Rock. Tyrion, 292 AC. Tyrion finds him in the library. Jon is 8 years old. Tyrion is visiting the rock between his own travels, between the particular wandering life of a man who has wealth and no required destination, and who uses the combination to fill the specific vacancy left by a family that has never known what to do with him. He sits across from Jon with the ease of a man who makes himself comfortable everywhere, because nowhere is more his than anywhere else. He says, "You're reading the Targaryen histories again." Jon says, "I read everything." Tyrion says, "You read the Targaryen histories more than everything else." He says it with the observation of someone who has been watching this child for 2 days and has opinions. He pauses. "What specifically interests you about them?" Jon says, "The dragons. How they died." Tyrion says, "That's a morbid interest for an 8-year-old. Jon says, "I want to understand the mechanism. Something made them stop." The histories don't fully explain what. Tyrion says, "The histories say inbreeding and confined spaces. The later dragons were smaller because they were kept in the dragon pit rather than flying free. The bloodline weakened because the Targaryens married family too consistently." Jon says, "That explains the physical decline." He pauses. It doesn't explain why no new dragons hatched from the eggs that existed. The eggs were there. Daenerys Targaryen had eggs in her tomb. The blood to hatch them still existed. But nothing hatched for 150 years. Tyrion looks at him. He says, "Most people don't ask that question." Jon says, "Most people are satisfied with the first answer that sounds reasonable." He says it without arrogance, as observation. The first answer is rarely the complete one. Tyrion says, "My father taught you that." Jon says, "Yes." Tyrion says, "He taught me the same thing." He pauses. He taught it to Jaime too, with less success. He refills his cup. He looks at Jon. "What is your theory?" "About the eggs." Jon says, "The connection was broken. Whatever made Targaryens able to wake the stone was something that diminished with the madness." He pauses. The last Targaryens who could hatch eggs were the last ones who were. He stops. He is careful. Who were psychologically intact enough to form the bond. He says it with the delicacy of someone discussing a topic he knows is sensitive for reasons he has not been told but has inferred. When the blood that the dragon recognizes is present but fractured, the recognition fails. Tyrion is very still. He says, "That is a remarkably specific theory." Jon says, "I've been working on it for a year." Tyrion says, "It assumes the connection is psychological rather than purely bloodline." Jon says both. He says it immediately. The bloodline opens the door. The psychology determines whether you can walk through it. Tyrion looks at this 8-year-old boy. He says, "Jon." He says the name with a specific quality, not the casual use of the household, but something more deliberate. "Who are you?" Jon says, "Lord Tywin's ward." Tyrion says, "That is not what I asked." Jon meets his eyes. He says, "I know." Tyrion says, "Does my father know you're asking these questions?" Jon says, "He knows I read everything. He knows I ask questions." He pauses. "I don't tell him specifically what I'm working on until I'm done working on it. He taught me that too. Don't show your hand until you know what you have." Tyrion almost laughs. He says, "He did teach you well." He looks at Jon with the specific expression that is Tyrion's closest approach to genuine warmth, the expression of a man who finds something delightful in the world and is surprised by it. "You know that I am the one Lannister in this family who actually asks questions rather than just issuing conclusions." Jon says, "I know. That's why you're the most dangerous." Tyrion blinks. Jon says, "Everyone underestimates you, including your father. He thinks you waste your potential because you choose pleasure over power. But you don't choose pleasure over power. You choose understanding over performance. Those are different." Tyrion says, "You've been watching me." Jon says, "I watch everyone." They look at each other across the table in the library of Casterly Rock, the dwarf Lannister and the grey-eyed ward, and something passes between them that is not quite an alliance and not quite a friendship, and is also, precisely, both. Tyrion says, I'm going to know who you are eventually. Jon says, probably. Tyrion says, when that happens, I hope we're on the same side. Jon says, we already are. He says it simply. Anyone who pays attention to the things that actually matter, rather than the things that look like they matter, is on the same side, as far as I'm concerned. Tyrion looks at him for a long time. He picks up his cup. He says, what are you reading next? Jon says, the reports from the Night's Watch. Tyrion says, those are not in this library. Jon says, no, they aren't. He pauses. I have an arrangement. Tyrion says, with whom? Jon says, Varys. Tyrion sets down his cup. He says, you have an arrangement with Varys. Jon says, he writes to me. I write back. He pauses. He is interested in what I think about things. Tyrion says, how long? Jon says, 2 years. Tyrion says, you are 8 years old. Jon says, I know. Tyrion stares at him. He says, does my father know? Jon says, no. Tyrion says, are you going to tell him? Jon says, when it becomes relevant. Tyrion picks up his cup again. He drinks. He sets it down. He says, Jon, whoever you are, whatever my father has made you. He pauses. Be careful. Jon says, I am always careful. Tyrion says, I know. He pauses. Be careful anyway. Casterly Rock. Cersei. 296 AT. Cersei has hated him since he was 4 years old. She has been careful about it. She is her father's daughter in this, as in other things, careful about the expressions of internal states that could be used against her. She has not said anything in Tywin's hearing that could be taken as overt hostility. She has not done anything directly. But Jon has been watching people since before he could articulate what watching meant, and he has watched Cersei for 12 years, and what he has seen is this. She watches him the way people watch things they do not understand and cannot categorize, and therefore cannot fully trust. She does not know what he is. She knows he is not what Tywin says he is. She has always known this. Cersei is not unintelligent, and the cover story for Jon has always had the thinness of cover stories that are designed to be credible at distance. Up close, to someone who is paying attention, it does not fully hold. She asked Tywin directly once, when Jon was 6. She said, what is he? Tywin said, he is my ward. She said, that is not what I asked. Tywin said, it is all you need to know. She looked at her father, and she understood. In the way she understands things, her father communicates through withholding them. But the thing Tywin was keeping from her was something significant, that the ward was not a ward in the ordinary sense, that there was calculation in it. She has been watching Jon for 12 years with the accumulating attention of someone building a case. She has not yet concluded the case. But she is close. Jon knows this. He is 12 years old, and he knows Cersei is close, and he has been thinking about how to manage it with the specific pragmatism that Casterly Rock teaches, which is not avoidance, but positioning. He cannot avoid Cersei. She is Tywin's daughter, and she is at the Rock several times a year. He cannot pretend she is not watching. He can decide what she sees. He decides to tell her. Not everything, not his parentage. That decision belongs to Tywin, and he will not make it unilaterally. But something true. He finds her in the garden on a spring morning. He approaches directly, which is the approach she will not expect, and which wrong-foots people who are expecting the managed performance they have been given for years. He says, Lady Cersei, may I speak with you? She looks at him with the particular green-eyed regard that she has been giving him for 12 years. Assessment. Wariness. The look of someone deciding how to categorize something that has resisted categorization. She says, speak. He says, you know I'm not who Lord Tywin says I am. She does not move. He says, I know you know. I've watched you put together the pieces for years. You're very good at it. He says this without flattery, as fact, because flattery would read as manipulation and she would see through it immediately. You haven't brought it to your father because you know he'll close the door and you need the door to stay open to learn more. She says, "You've been watching me." He says, "I watch everyone." He pauses. "Lord Tywin taught me to." She looks at him. She says, "What are you?" He says, "I'm not going to tell you. That's not my information to give." She says, "Then why are you here?" He says, "Because I want you to know that I am not a threat to Joffrey's succession. Whatever I am, whatever my blood is, I have no intention toward the throne." He pauses. "And I want you to know that continuing to investigate me will eventually reach information that is more dangerous to your family than it is to me." She is very still. He says, "I am not threatening you. I am telling you a fact about the information landscape. If you know what I am, you are responsible for that knowledge. And the responsibility for that knowledge is larger than you want." She looks at him for a long time. She says, "You're 12 years old." He says, "Yes." She says, "You talk like my father." He says, "He raised me." A silence. She says, "If you are not a threat to Joffrey's succession, why does my father keep you hidden?" Jon says, "Because some things are safer hidden." He pauses. "Your father is very good at knowing the difference." She looks at him. She does not trust him. She will never fully trust him, because Cersei Lannister does not fully trust anyone she did not give birth to, and even then, it is complicated. But she is recalibrating. He can see it happening. She says, "If I find out you have lied to me." He says, "You won't. I haven't lied to you. I've withheld. Those are different." She says, "In this family, they are the same." He says, "Then we understand each other." He walks away. He does not look back. Behind him, Cersei watches him go. She thinks. Tywin would have said exactly that. She thinks. Whatever he is something. She does not press further. Not that year. Casterly Rock. Jaime, 297 Act. Jaime Lannister comes home in the 13th year. He comes with the particular quality of a man who has been wearing a white cloak for a decade and is aware that the cloak covers things it was not designed to cover. He is beautiful and gifted and famous and carries something heavy underneath all three of those things that the fame and the beauty prevent most people from looking at directly. Jon is 13. He has been watching Jaime for years in the way he watches everyone, building the picture gradually from what is said and what is not said, and what the specific gaps between those things reveal. He knows about Cersei. He has known since he was 10, assembled from pieces, confirmed by inference. He has said nothing. He will not say anything unless it becomes relevant to something that requires it. He watches Jaime in the training yard. Jaime is extraordinary. Jon has been trained by good men. He has reached the level where good men are not enough, and he knows it. He watches Jaime move through forms in the yard on the first morning, and he knows in his body, in the specific recognition of a trained fighter encountering a vastly better one, that this is what the ceiling looks like. He approaches. He says, "Sir Jaime, may I ask you something?" Jaime looks at him. He has the golden regard of a man accustomed to being looked at and accustomed to controlling what is seen. He looks at Jon with the evaluation that all Lannisters seem to carry, and finds something that makes him look again, the second look that Jon is accustomed to prompting. He says, "Ask." Jon says, "I've been watching you train. You move differently from the style Saharic teaches. Not worse. Different. Where does the difference come from?" Jaime says, "From fighting actual men rather than training dummies." Jon says, "Saharic has fought actual men." Jaime says, "Not the same men." Jon says, "The Kingsguard." Jaime says, "Among others." Jon says, "Will you show me?" Jaime looks at him. Something crosses his face that is not quite amusement and not quite assessment. Genuine interest, possibly, in a thing he did not expect to be interested in. He says, "Pick up a sword." Jon picks up a sword. They spar for 20 minutes. At the end of the 20 minutes, Jaime is looking at Jon with the expression he started with replaced by something else entirely. He says, "How old are you?" Jon says, 13. Jaime says, "Who trained you?" Jon says, Sir Harwick. Before him, Sir Adam. And a Bravosi my father arranged correspondence with. He uses father without thinking, the word that means Tywin, not by blood, but by presence. Jaime says, you fight like you've been trained by 3 people who disagree about the fundamentals. Jon says, yes. He pauses. I took the parts that worked. Jaime looks at him. He says, that sounds like something my father would say. Jon says, he said it first. I'm applying it. Jaime is quiet for a moment. He says, who are you? Jon says, Lord Tywin's ward. Jaime says, I know that. He says it the way his sister said it, with the specific emphasis of a man who has catalogued the answer and found it insufficient. He looks at Jon. My father does not make investments without purpose. He pauses. You are an investment. Jon says, everyone in this castle is an investment of some kind. Jaime says, not like you. He looks at the grey eyes. Not like you. He pauses. I'm not going to press you. My father will tell me when he decides to. He pauses. But I want you to know that I see it, whatever it is. Jon says, what do you see? Jaime says, someone who is going to matter. He says it simply, the way fighters say things about other fighters, the professional recognition of capability. He pauses. I don't know in what way, but in some way. Jon nods. He says, Sir Jaime, in the years I've been here, I have never asked you anything about the Kingsguard. Jaime looks at him. Jon says, I would like to ask now, if you'll permit. Jaime says, ask. Jon says, the oath. What does it feel like when the thing you swore to protect becomes something that can't be protected the way you swore to protect it? The question lands in the air between them. Jaime is very still. He says, that is not a question a ward usually asks. Jon says, no. Jaime says, why are you asking it? Jon says, because I have been given a responsibility by Lord Tywin that I did not choose and did not ask for, and that I cannot discharge by being only what I was told to be. He pauses. I want to know how someone keeps their honor intact when the world does not cooperate with honor. Jaime looks at him for a long time. He says, you find out what your honor is actually about. Underneath the oath, underneath the specific words, what it is actually protecting. He pauses. And you protect that. Jon says, even if it costs you the oath? Jaime says, even if. He says it with the weight of a man who has made this calculation and is still living in the cost of it. Jon nods. He says, thank you. He goes back to training. Jaime watches him go. He goes to find Tywin. He says, that ward of yours. Tywin says, yes. Jaime says, he asked me about oath breaking and honor. Tywin says, and? Jaime says, and I answered him honestly. He pauses. Father, what have you made? Tywin says, something useful. Jaime looks at him. He says, tell me. Tywin is quiet for a long moment. He says, sit down, Jaime. Jaime sits. Tywin tells him, Casterly Rock, 298 Aki. 14 years later. Jon is 14 years old, and Tywin is teaching him the final lesson. Not a lesson in a subject. The lesson that everything else has been building toward. The lesson that is not about content, but about application. The lesson of what all of it is for. They are in the solar. Tywin says, Robert is going north. Jon says, I know. He received word from Varys. Tywin looks at him. Jon says, I have an arrangement with Lord Varys. He pauses. You have one too. I found out about yours 2 years ago. Mine is more recent. Tywin says, you have been running your own intelligence operation. Jon says, I have been collecting information. He says it calmly. You told me knowledge is the foundation of everything. Tywin is quiet for a moment. He says, what does Varys want from you? Jon says, he wants a viable future for the realm. He pauses. He has been working toward that for a long time. His methods are his own, but his goal, as far as I can tell, is genuine. Tywin says, Varys's methods include you. Jon says, yes. Tywin says, and you have been, Jon says, thinking about my options. Tywin says, "Your options." Jon says, "I am 14 years old, and I have been living in Casterly Rock for 14 years, and I have been given the best education in Westeros, and trained to fight by a man who trained soldiers and taught the language of power by the most powerful man in the realm." He looks at Tywin. "You did not do all of this for no reason." Tywin says no. Jon says, "Tell me the reason." Tywin looks at his ward. He has been looking at this boy for 14 years, and the boy has been looking back, and for 14 years Tywin has been the one who set the terms of the looking, and now he is aware that the terms have shifted. The assessment is mutual. The looking goes both ways. He says, Robert is going to ask Ned Stark to be his hand. If Ned accepts, the Stark family comes to King's Landing. If the Stark family comes to King's Landing, the political landscape of the city changes in ways that will eventually force several things to become visible that are currently managed. Jon says, "Including me." Tywin says, "Including the truth about Joffrey's parentage, which Jon Arryn died discovering, and which is currently the most explosive secret in King's Landing." Jon says, "You know about that." Tywin says, "I have known for 2 years." Jon says, "And you have said nothing because," Tywin says, "because the information, deployed at the wrong moment, destroys everything I have built, and because the right moment has not yet arrived." Jon looks at him. He says, "What makes it the right moment?" Tywin says, "When there is an alternative to Joffrey that is better than the chaos of his removal." Jon is very still. He says, "Me." Tywin says nothing. Jon says, "You have been building toward this for 14 years. A Targaryen heir. Raised by you. Educated by you. Loyal to the Lannister interest by upbringing, if not by blood." He pauses. "A king you can manage." Tywin says, "A king who can govern." Jon says, "That is not the same thing." Tywin says, "No, it is not." Another silence. Jon says, "I told you once that I had no intention toward the throne." Tywin says, "You were 12 years old. You said what you believed at the time." Jon says, "I still believe it." He looks at Tywin. "I don't want the throne. I want the realm." He pauses. Those are different things. The throne is a chair in a room where people perform loyalty. The realm is the actual place with actual people and actual problems that require actual solutions. Tywin says, "And the throne controls the realm." Jon says, "The throne influences the realm." He says it with the precision of someone who has been passing the distinction for years. It controls very little directly. Its power is primarily the power to set priorities and direct attention and shape the environment in which other decisions are made. He pauses, which is enormous, but it is not the same as control. Tywin looks at him. He says, "Where did you learn that?" Jon says, "From watching you." He says it directly. You don't try to control everything. You try to control the conditions under which things happen. You shape the environment and let the environment do most of the work. Tywin is quiet for a long moment. He says, "You've been paying attention." Jon says, "I've been doing nothing but paying attention for 14 years. Tywin says, "And what have you concluded?" Jon says, "That you are the most capable person I know, and also that your definition of success is too narrow." He says it plainly. You think about the Lannister name. You think about legacy. You think about what the family builds and holds. He pauses. You don't think about what the realm is for. Tywin says, "What is it for?" Jon says, "The people in it. All of them. Not just the ones who pay taxes or hold swords or have names worth remembering." He pauses. "And there is something coming that is going to make all of our political calculations look very small." Tywin says, "The North." Jon says, "I've been reading the Watch's reports for 2 years. My own copies, not the summaries you give the small council." He pauses. "Lord Tywin, whatever is coming from beyond the wall is not a political problem. It is an existential one. And the question of who sits on the Iron Throne only matters if the Iron Throne still exists." Tywin looks at him. The flat attention. The comprehensive assessment. He says, "What do you propose?" Jon says, "I need to go north." Tywin says, "You are 14. Jon says, I know. In 2 years I'll be 16. In 2 years Robert will have been in King's Landing for 2 years, and whatever Ned Stark discovers will have had time to become a crisis. He pauses. I want to go north before it becomes a crisis. I want to go to the wall. I want to see what is there with my own eyes. Tywin says, and then? Jon says, and then I'll know what we're actually dealing with, and I'll come back and tell you, and we will plan accordingly. He says, we. Not deliberately, not as a performance of loyalty, because 14 years of breakfasts and lessons, and the specific education that Tywin Lannister gives to the one person in his life he has genuinely invested in without calculation, or with a calculation that became something else in the executing, has made it we in a way that Jon cannot entirely separate himself from. He is not a Lannister. But he is not one. Tywin looks at him. He says 2 years. Jon says 2 years. Tywin says, and in those 2 years you will continue your training and your study. You will learn everything I can teach you about the court you are going to enter. Jon says, yes. Tywin says, and when you go north, you go with men I choose, not alone. Jon says, agreed. Tywin says, and you come back. Jon says, I told you. I come back. Tywin is quiet. He looks at his ward. He looks at this boy he took from Ned Stark's arms 14 years ago and kept and shaped and taught in the specific way that Tywin Lannister teaches things, which is completely and without sentimentality and with an absolute commitment to producing something excellent. He thinks, he is better than I intended. He thinks, he may be better than me. He says, good, then in 2 years you go north. Jon nods. He stands. He says, Lord Tywin. Tywin looks at him. Jon says, what you did, taking me in, teaching me. He pauses. I know it was not charity. I know what you calculated when you made the decision. He pauses again. But it is also the reason I am alive and capable and in a position to do what needs to be done. He looks at Tywin with the grey eyes that are not Lannister eyes. So, thank you. For both things. For the calculation and for the execution of it. Tywin says nothing for a long moment. He says, go train. Jon goes. Tywin sits in the solar. He sits for a long time. He thinks about what he made. He thinks, I set out to make a weapon. He thinks, what I made is better than a weapon. He does not say this to anyone. He does not have to. Casterly Rock. Tywin's study. The night of the truth. After Jon leaves the solar, Tywin does not move for a long time. He sits at his desk with the flat candlelight on the documents in front of him, and he does something that Tywin Lannister almost never does. He thinks about whether he made the right choice, not the first choice. Not the decision to take the child from Ned Stark on the road. He has not revisited that decision, because revisiting decisions already made is wasteful, and he was right about the calculus anyway. The child alive and shaped is better than the child dead or hidden and innocent. He thinks about the teaching. He has given Jon everything he knows. Not quite, but close. The languages and the fighting and the political architecture of the realm and the financial structures of Westerosi power and the specific patterns of how houses rise and fall and why. He has given Jon the complete Tywin Lannister curriculum, and Jon has taken it and built something from it that Tywin did not plan. He thinks about the grain contracts conversation. The 6-year-old who heard the lesson about profit and immediately thought about the people who couldn't afford bread. He thinks about the moment he said, correct. He thinks about meaning it. He has said correct to Jon's observations 800 times in 11 years of breakfast. He cannot remember the last time he said it to Cersei or Jaime. He thinks, I did not intend to raise someone I respect. He thinks, that is what happened anyway. He thinks about the Targaryen blood, about what he understood when he took the child, which was leverage and utility, and the cold calculation of a man who sees resources and manages them. He thinks about what he understands now, 11 years later, which is different. The child is the resource. but the child is also a person. This is the thing that changes in 11 years of raising something. It starts as management and becomes something else, not love, exactly. Tywin does not examine himself closely enough to name what it has become. But something that is not nothing. Something that is its own category. He picks up a cup of wine. He sets it down without drinking. He thinks about the north. About what is coming, about the reports that he has been reading for 20 years, with the specific attention of a man who believes in patterns, and the Night's Watch reports form a pattern that is not ambiguous. He thinks about sending Jon north in 2 years. He thinks about Jon standing at the wall in 2 years with those grey eyes, and that Targaryen blood, and the complete education of Casterly Rock, and looking at what is coming. He thinks, I have prepared him for what I can see. He thinks, what is coming may require more than I can see. He picks up the wine again. He drinks. He thinks, that boy is the only thing I have made that is entirely itself. Not the Lannister legacy, not the family name, not an extension of my will into the future. Himself. His own. He sets down the cup. He goes to bed. He sleeps. He does not dream. The rock. The yard. Later that evening. Jon trains until the sun is gone. Sir Adam left 5 years ago. He was replaced by a man named Sir Harwick, who is better, which is what Jon asked Tywin for, and which Tywin provided without comment. Harwick trains him the way Adam started, which is to find the limits and push past them, and the limits have moved considerably in 5 years. He trains alone in the yard after the household has gone in. He works through the forms. The southern style. The thing that is not quite the water dance, but is adjacent to it, learned from a book and from correspondence with a Bravosi sellsword that Tywin arranged, because Jon asked for it. The fighting style he thinks of as just his, assembled from all the others. He stops. He looks at the sky over the sea. He thinks about the north. He has never been north. He has been to King's Landing once, briefly, managed carefully, a trip Tywin made for court and brought Jon along to observe rather than participate. He was 10. He watched the court with the same attention he watches everything, and he filed what he saw and came home with a picture of the city that he has been adding to since through books and letters and Varys' specific information. He has never seen the wall. He has read about it for years. He has studied the architecture and the history and the geography of the far north with the systematic patience of someone preparing for a journey that is not yet scheduled but is definitely coming. He has corresponded with the Lord Commander through a channel Tywin established, careful correspondence, learning the facts. He has not seen it. He will, in 2 years. He looks at the sea and he thinks about fire and ice and the prophecies he has read and the patterns he has traced and the specific conclusion he has reached, which is that the world is going to require something very particular in the years ahead, and he has been shaped, improbably and precisely, for what is required. He is not naive about this. He is Tywin Lannister's ward in the way that wards are formed by their guardians, carrying the shape of what raised them. He thinks in the language of power and preparation, and the patient management of variables. He approaches problems the way Casterly Rock approaches everything, with resources and structure and the specific ruthlessness of a house that has survived 800 years, by understanding that survival requires it. But he is also something Tywin did not plan. He is the part that read about the small folk and worried about their grain. He is the part that watches people not as pieces to be moved, but as people who are doing the best they can with what they have. He is the part that said, the realm is what it's for, all the people in it. That part Tywin did not teach him. That part came from somewhere Tywin cannot access and did not build. He does not know where it came from. He thinks it might be hers. His mother's, the northern woman who carried him and died for him, and whose blood runs in him alongside the Valyrian fire. He looks north He cannot see north from here. The rock faces west, toward the sea, toward the horizon where the sun goes, but he looks north anyway. He thinks, I'm coming. He goes back inside. He has lessons in the morning. What if Tywin Lannister raised Jon Snow? He did not make him soft. He would never make anything soft. He made him sharp and patient and capable and aware of the exact shape of the world he was walking into. He taught him that knowledge is the foundation of everything. He taught him that preparation is the only hedge against chaos. He taught him that a Lannister always pays their debts. Jon Snow is not a Lannister. But he learned the lesson anyway, and when the long night comes, when the cold moves south, and the dead walk, and the realm needs something it has never needed before, it will not be a king on a throne who answers it. It will be the ward of Casterly Rock, the last Targaryen, the boy Tywin Lannister made into something the realm was not ready for. Ready, Casterly Rock. Ned's final visit before King's Landing. 298 AC. Ned comes in the spring. He always comes in the spring. Jon is 14 now, and the visit has a different quality than it had when Jon was 4 and slipped his hand into Ned's in the garden. They are both older, and the relationship between them has become something more complicated, not less warm, but more aware of what it is and what it is not. Jon is the thing Ned gave up, and comes to see the giving working out better than he feared. He is also the thing Ned cannot take back, and would not take back, because the taking back might have killed him. Both of these things are present in every visit, and neither of them is said. They walk in the garden. Jon says, I hear Robert is going north. Ned says, yes. Jon says, he'll ask you to be hand. Ned says, he might. Jon says, he will. He's been planning it for months. He says it with the specific certainty of a person who knows because they were told by someone who knows. He watches Ned absorb this. He says, Varys. Ned says, of course. Jon says, if you go to King's Landing. He pauses. There are things happening there that are going to become crises. I cannot tell you specifically. Lord Tywin manages that information, and I respect the management, but I can tell you that you should go with more caution than you typically carry. Ned looks at him. He says, what kind of caution? Jon says, the kind that asks whether the person offering you help has reasons of their own that may not align with yours. He pauses. King's Landing is not Winterfell. People in King's Landing do not mean what they say as a general rule. Ned says, I know that. Jon says, you know it in the way people know things they have not fully felt. He says it gently, without unkindness, because you are the most honest man I have ever met, and honest people have to work harder to account for dishonesty than dishonest people do. Ned looks at him. He says, you sound like Tywin. Jon says, he raised me. Ned says, I know. A silence. Ned says, are you all right? Here. Still. Jon says, yes. He says it honestly. I am more than all right. He has given me things I could not have gotten anywhere else. He pauses. I know that is strange to say, given. Ned says no. He says it quietly. It is not strange. He pauses. I made the best choice I could with what I had. I did not know it would produce this. He gestures at Jon, at 14-year-old Jon, who speaks 3 languages and fights like a soldier and reads the Night's Watch reports and has an arrangement with Varys. But I am. He stops. I am glad you are well. Jon says, and I am glad you come. They walk. Jon says, when I go north. In 2 years. If you are at King's Landing. Will you come to the wall? Ned says, try to keep me away. Jon almost smiles. It is the closest he gets to it, this almost smile, this expression that is the edge of warmth rather than the full display. He has learned from Tywin's household that warmth displayed is warmth that can be used against you, but the edge of it is still visible in the right light, in the right company. Ned sees it. He recognizes it. He recognizes it because it is the same expression Lyanna had. The almost smile, the edge of warmth. The thing she showed when she was fully present with someone she trusted. He looks away, before the grief in his face becomes visible. Jon notices, but says nothing. They part at the gate. Ned rides north to prepare for what Robert is going to ask. Jon goes back to his lessons. He goes back to preparing for the north. He goes back to becoming what he is. Casterly Rock. The last lesson. 298 Ac. Late autumn. There is one more thing Tywin teaches him. He teaches it not in the solar, not over breakfast, not in the formal setting of instruction. He teaches it on an evening when the year has turned cold, and the sea below Casterly Rock is grey and restless, and Tywin is standing at the window looking at it. Jon finds him there. He does not ask what Tywin is looking at. He stands beside him and looks at the same sea. After a long time, Tywin says, "When my wife died, Joanna." He says it with no preparation, no preamble. I did not grieve publicly. There was no benefit to public grief. There was no point in displaying what it cost me. He pauses. I made a mistake. Jon waits. Tywin says, "The mistake was in thinking that not displaying it meant not feeling it, and that not feeling it was something I could choose." He pauses. It was not a choice. The grief was there. I managed it into contempt and distance and the particular coldness that my children know and that you know. He says it plainly, without sentimentality. As accurate diagnosis, and that coldness cost me things I did not intend to spend. Jon says, "Cersei." Tywin says, "Cersei learned from me that love is weakness. She applied the lesson with the enthusiasm of a student who understood it perfectly." He pauses. The lesson was wrong. He says it with the specific difficulty of a man for whom admitting error is not natural, but who has decided honesty is worth the cost. I taught it because I believed it. I believed it because the alternative was too painful to examine. Jon says nothing. Tywin says, "Love is not weakness." He says it with the flatness of a man stating a thing he has arrived at through long analysis, rather than feeling. Love is leverage that works both ways. If the people you care about are taken from you, you can lose things that matter. But without the caring, the things you accumulate have no direction. They are just accumulation. He pauses. I accumulated. He looks at the sea. I am not certain I built. Jon says, "You built this." Tywin looks at him. Jon says, "Me. Whatever I am." He says it without pride, as fact. You didn't have to. You could have disposed of me and managed the information differently. You chose to make something of it. He pauses. That is building. Tywin is quiet for a long time. He says, "Go to sleep. You have an early morning." Jon goes. Tywin stands at the window. He stands there for a long time. He thinks about the boy who grows into the man who goes north in 2 years, and stands at the wall and looks at what is coming and does not flinch from it because Casterly Rock taught him to look at everything directly, to not flinch from things that are real simply because they are terrible. He thinks, I gave him the tools. He thinks the rest was always his. He turns from the window. He goes to his desk. He picks up a quill. He begins the next day's work. Outside, the sea moves in its ancient indifferent way, caring nothing for Targaryens or Lannisters or the long night that is coming from the north. The tide comes in. The tide goes out. And in Casterly Rock, the last Targaryen sleeps the sleep of someone who knows what they are and what they are for, and who is not afraid of either. Ready.